Paradox Interactive's Imperator Rome has lived several lives since its release in 2019. From a rocky start to patches, DLCs, more patches, and hiatus in 2021, Imperator slowly evolved from one of Paradox's most disappointing outings to possibly the most underrated grand strategy game ever made. In this video, we'll take a look at the development history, release, improvements, and gameplay of Imperator's visit to classical antiquity. And we'll try to answer the question, what changed about the game to transform it from a letdown to a triumph? Also, from the outset, I know there are different ways to pronounce Imperator, including Imperator. I'm going with Imperator because that's how I learned it in high school when I was playing Rome Total War, and it's what I hear in my mind. Apologies if I'm butchering the word or any other Latin pronunciations that might come up during the course of this history. Imperator was not Paradox's first dive into Roman history. In 2008, Europa Universalis Rome was released on PC to mostly middling reviews. Similar to its successor, EU Rome starts in the decades after the death of Alexander the Great and ends in 27 BC or 727 AUC for those of us following the Roman calendar. Different than nearly all of Paradox's other grand strategy games, however, the game was turn-based. It received a single expansion, Victus, releasing the same year as the main game. Victus received generally positive reviews upon release. It would take another 10 years for Paradox to approach the Eternal City again. Officially revealed on May 19, 2018, Imperator Rome promised to showcase everything Paradox had learned in the last decade. In the intervening years between antiquity-based games, Paradox Development Studio, or PDS, had published Hearts of Iron 3 and 4, Victoria 2, Crusader Kings 2, Europa Universalis 4, and Stellaris. Among fans, despite some having uneven releases, these games are in the pantheon of some of Paradox's greatest. The trailer that released in May 2018 implied scenarios that the player may face, from diplomacy to violence. It eclipsed 150,000 views in 24 hours, with over 4,000 likes against a mere 149 dislikes, a ratio of more than 25 to 1. Within 3 days, it had over 1 million views and nearly 8,000 likes. Fans were excited for the new adventure that surely awaited them in the Mediterranean, leaving hundreds of thrilled comments. There were also dozens of comments about how Victoria 3 would never release, but that's a story for another day. At PDXCon 2018, game director Johan Andersson showed off the map of Imperator and discussed provinces, trade routes, character models, units, and more. Or, as the Romans would have said it, etc. The next week, on May 28th on Paradox Forum, the company released its first developer diary, or dev diary, about Imperator. It outlined the basic vision of what the game would look and play like, as well as some comments about what changes will have been made compared to EU Rome. In less than 3 days, the post had received over 300 responses. With the successes of the last decade, players were hyped to see the next masterstroke from PDS. Each subsequent Monday, a dev diary was released with sneak peeks of what was coming. 4 different resources known as powers, different types of pops, technologies, maps, buildings, and so much more. For the most part, fans seemed thrilled about the new game, though a handful voiced their concern about certain gameplay mechanics being stuck behind abstract mana pools. Simultaneously, Paradox released several previews with gameplay. These discussed elements in the game in real time as developers played. Budding Caesars were agog with posts, questions, and even more comments about how Victoria 3 would never release. On February 5th, 2019, Paradox announced on YouTube that it would be time to don a toga very soon. April 25th, 2019. Likes poured in faster than the Tiber flows, with more than 50 likes for every dislike, and in 3 days, the video had eclipsed 500,000 views. Fans were excited, celebrating in the comments, with many ironically writing that they were looking forward to spending hundreds of dollars on DLC for the game in the next 5 years. One way or another, though, it was obvious developers were hard at work, and supporters could barely wait for April 25th to arrive. Finally, the date came. Personally, I was so hyped for the game's release that I took a day off from work just to play. And like many other players, my feelings on Imperator were mixed. Critic reviews ran the gamut of middling to glowing. Praise centered around the synthesis of Crusader Kings 2 and Europa Universalis 4, with perhaps a sprinkling of Victoria 2. Ironically, this was also a criticism from players who did not enjoy the game. Reviewers who liked the game also appreciated that war seemed more front and center than previous Paradox titles. As PC Gamer wrote in their 92 out of 100 review, quote, "Imperator's wars are some of Paradox's best. Once you've fabricated claims on provinces and found an excuse for war, you can start marching your troops across the border towards their objective." End quote. Destructoid's 90 out of 100 review also hailed its war mechanics, as well as how your population was controlled. Anthony Marzano wrote, quote, "The population concept from Victoria 2 returns in Imperator, but in a more easily digestible fashion. Each province on the map has a number of people living in it. These populations are split into 4 classes, and depending on how many of each class you have in areas you control, your production and unrest go up and down. Each populace also has a culture and religion attached to it, which can cause headaches if you are a foreign leader taking over their land, or if people start to immigrate into your area from a neighboring region. You can manipulate the populace by using political or religious power depending on what you are trying to accomplish, which I found fun in a maniacal way." End quote. Simultaneously, many reviewers were not terribly impressed by Imperator. GameSpot's 5 out of 10 review encapsulated the feelings of disappointment by writing, quote, "Imperator Rome feels undercooked. As it stands, it's a strange mishmash of several of Paradox's existing, and let's be honest, superior games, without much to distinguish or recommend it. Paradox recently outlined a 1-year plan for the title in an effort to reassure players that they are aware of its shortcomings and intend to address them. That roadmap appears insubstantial to my eyes, but we'll see when we get there. For now, Imperator Rome remains a decidedly modest strategy game." End quote. Strategy Gamer's 60 out of 100 review echoed this, explaining, quote, "In their quest to offer breadth and an even playing experience throughout the ancient world, I fear Paradox have perhaps overlooked the need to bring out the character and flavor of the era to help mask the blanks that have yet to be filled. Imperator Rome has its moments and some excellent foundation, but while there's always the promise of what's to come, right here and now there's plenty to be found wanting." End quote. Veterans of grand strategy games also complained of what they perceived as a lack of depth present in Imperator. Many reviewers wrote about their expectations that in the near future, Paradox would release DLCs to add meat to the bones of the game, as well as patches to fix its bugs and performance issues. There was also hope that mods would pick up part of the slack as well. Among regular fans, some celebrated a return to antiquity, the beauty of the map, and certain aspects of the battle mechanics. Overall, however, most players' reactions were muted and many were negative. Numerous people reported playing for 10 to 20 hours, having fun, but then feeling that they had run out of things to do. For example, there were only 4 types of buildings that could be constructed in a city. Another complaint that was levied was that naval engagements were nearly non-existent, as well as few real ways to interact with characters in the game. A great deal of fans took particular issue with the systems in the game. One problem, they wrote, was the so-called mana implemented in Imperator. People said they simply did not have enough to do while waiting for a seemingly arbitrary number to go up so they could take an action. Redditor Biohazard772 garnered over 1,000 upvotes in 4 days after the release of Imperator by writing, quote, "I think the biggest reason why I hate mana is the fact that the entire flavor of the game is sucked out by the over-abstraction. You are not planning an invasion, you are gathering points. You are not organizing a religion, you are picking a buff. You are not managing new populations, you are exchanging points for less issues." End quote. On Paradox Forum, discussions focused on strategy, game questions, bugs, and the seemingly small list of songs in the game's soundtrack. Reviewers on Steam were not kind to Imperator. Within a day of the game's release, only 54% of reviews were positive. After a month, that number was only 46%. And after 2, recent reviews were at an abysmal 25% positive. The negative reviews centered around a perceived lack of depth and the expectation that DLCs would be sold to consumers to make the game feel fleshed out instead of being included in the base game at release. And according to Steam charts, the player count of Imperator cratered in a way not seen in any of its contemporary grand strategy games. In April 2019, the game had over 13,600 players on average per day. By the next month, it was barely over 1,600. Whether entirely deserved or not, the release of Imperator Rome was not what either Paradox or most fans were hoping. Within a day of release, game director Johan Andersson posted 2 messages on Paradox Forum. One outlined the roadmap for Imperator moving forward, and another detailed how Paradox develops games. In his roadmap post, Andersson expressed his gratitude with the feedback from players, then wrote that patch 1.0.1 was already being worked on to, quote, improve the AI, fix compatibility issues, game crashes, some multiplayer out of syncs, and will also contain some performance improvements, end quote. Then, Andersson outlined a slew of changes that would be arriving in the upcoming 1.1 patch, Pompey. The list included changes in technology, population, and stability mechanics, a reworking of naval combat, character interactions, government abilities, quality of life changes, and many more. On the roadmap post, reactions were largely positive from the community with excitement for what was to come in 1.1 whenever it was to arrive. Fans' reactions were more muted on Andersson's other post from the same day. In that message, Andersson detailed how he saw game development. He explained that in an alpha build, you basically have to get all of the features of your project locked in. Then, in the beta, you stop adding and revising heavily features. As you draw within 2 months of release, you stabilize the game as much as possible and make certain the AI knows what it's doing. He then wrote that the 1.1 patch Pompey would be out in June, but that it also started development around 2 months before Imperator was released. Anderson wrote that it had many ideas that we wanted to implement when the time was right, and that the patch was content complete but unstable. Responses to this post were more mixed, with many commenting that Paradox should have waited to release the game when most of its bugs were fixed and new gameplay mechanics were implemented. Simultaneously, however, many comments praised Anderson for addressing players' concerns publicly. As with the lead-up to Imperator's release, dev diaries were published as Pompey was in development. These, however, were more frequent, with 1 week seeing a total of 4 published. As the weeks went by, many players put down Imperator, waiting for 1.1 to be released, while others delayed buying the game in the first place to see what the new patch would bring. On June 26, 2019, Pompey made its debut. The same day as Pompey's release, Paradox published a YouTube video breaking down the additions the patch brought, narrated by content designer Peter Nicholson. The game's naval rework was front and center, with stability, weather, and population changes among other additions. These did not drive a large increase in players, however, with fewer than 1,000 people playing the game per day on average in July 2019, 3 months after its release. To put this into perspective, Crusader Kings 3 launched the next year. 3 months after launch, it had an average of more than 21,000 players per day. Stellaris, which had launched 3 years earlier, had over 9,100 people 3 months after launch, and Hearts of Iron 4 had more than 9,800. Positive reviews were also in relatively short supply for Imperator, with 55% of reviews being positive in July of 2019 and a mere 39% in August. These numbers were worse than Paradox's Sengoku, which released in 2011 to little fanfare. A mere 5 days after the release of the Pompey patch, Paradox released its first dev diary for patch 1.2, which they called Cicero. In 6 days, developers posted 8 messages to fans about Cicero and the changes it promised to bring. The newest changes included being able to disband legions loyal to a general, the construction of more than 4 buildings per city, and UI and map improvements. On Paradox's forums, fans were excited to see more work and improvement on the game. They were also happy with what seemed to be less of a reliance on mana and more flexibility for the player. And with Cicero's release on September 24th, it seemed that Imperator's ship, which I assume was a trireme, was being turned in the right direction. Positive reviews on Steam dramatically increased, breaking 70% in October and reaching 83% in November. Comments on Paradox Forum and Reddit were largely positive as well. Overall, the added depth and improved UI brought some players back and impressed ones that never left. Player numbers also briefly rebounded, with more than 2,800 players per day in September, and with more than 6,000 people playing per day in November. Hot on the heels of Cicero, Paradox immediately announced a third major patch, which it called Livy, as well as a free DLC called the Punic Wars. This patch looked to add depth to important families in your civilization, added the ability for players to choose one of 3 missions to achieve for rewards, and added more map and UI improvements. These changes once again moved away from strict mana pooling, gave additional flexibility and role-playing for players, and fixed some outstanding bugs. Slowly, it seemed that Paradox was fulfilling the roadmap it had drawn in April of 2019 after Imperator's inauspicious release. Despite these omens, however, all was not good in Rome. The number of players never returned to even close to what it was earlier in 2019. Livy released in early December 2019, but the average daily player count was a mere 2,200 that month, and then dipped to 1,700 in January 2020. This did not bode well for Imperator's future. Like so many things in 2020, nothing went quite right for Imperator. Patch 1.4 Archimedes released around the same time the world shut down in March. It added more depth to mission trees, tweaked the economy in numerous ways, changed some war and unit mechanics, and more. That month, player counts rebounded to more than 6,000 a day, but once again plummeted immediately after. Patch 1.5 Menander released in August. It improved the integration of culture and added depth to that mechanic, included the fixing of bugs and stability issues, improved the game's AI, as well as other tweaks. The DLCs Magna Graecia and Epirus were also released during this time. But the lightning was out of the bottle for Imperator. From September to December, the average daily player count did not break 1,000. In comparison, Paradox's other grand strategy games were thriving. Hearts of Iron 4 saw its monthly player count increase during the exact same time frame, going from 32,124 in August 2020 to 38,745 in December. So too did Europa Universalis, with the average in August being 19,618, and then 26,680 in December. So too did Stellaris, with an increase of nearly 3,000 daily players. Crusader Kings 3 averaged over 20,000 at that time. And to add insult to injury, even Crusader Kings 2, which had been succeeded by Crusader Kings 3, averaged more than 5 times the players that Imperator did during that span. Again, Imperator could not break even 1,000 on average. Even Victoria 2 had more simultaneous players than Imperator at this time, despite having no official patch or content for 4 years by then. But Imperator was not dead yet. Paradox was working on the biggest patch for the game yet, skipping patch 1.6, instead going straight to patch 2.0, Marius. The patch, which content designer Peter Nicholson called unprecedented, would take longer than the others, but it promised to enhance the visuals of the game greatly, noticeably improve the pacing of the game, and make warfare more realistic and, as a result, more enjoyable. These major changes necessitated the extra time and justified calling the patch 2.0 instead of 1.6. Additionally, AI was slated to be improved, as well as many balancing issues. These announcements excited Imperator fans across the board. Hundreds of comments flowed in with praise for the upcoming changes and anticipation for Marius to arrive. Simultaneously, it is also one of the major reasons why the player count was so depressed in late 2020, as players held off jumping into the game until 2.0's release. Released alongside the DLC Heirs of Alexander, Marius debuted on February 16, 2021, nearly 2 years after Imperator was officially released. Praise for 2.0 was nearly universal. Scores of comments populated Reddit and Paradox Forum praising the changes made to the game. The issues that had weighed Imperator down at release, depth, player choice, lack of naval engagements, AI, variety in buildings, bugs, and mana, had all been either fixed or greatly improved. Reviews on Steam were positive, with 85% of reviews in March 2021 recommending the game. The average number of daily players also spiked, with over 7,000 per day in January of 2021, the month before the update. Over 4,000 people played per day in February, however, when Marius actually arrived, and then around 2,100 in March, and fewer than 2,000 in April. Despite the fanfare and positivity surrounding 2.0 and word of mouth, players did not consistently return to Imperator or buy it for the first time. On Paradox Forum on April 30th, 2021, Bevan Davies, Paradox's segment and portfolio manager for strategy games, made an announcement. According to Davies, because of changes made at Paradox Development Studio, new content for Imperator had been put on hiatus. He wrote, quote, "You might have noticed that Imperator Rome isn't assigned to any of the studios mentioned above. The reason for this is that on a regular basis we analyze the projects we have in development, where they are at, what they are trying to do, and also what people and resources we have working on them. As part of this analysis, we realized that there was a need to bring reinforcement for a couple of the projects at PDS, and given where Imperator was in the run-up to 2.0's launch, we decided that after the launch of the update, we would move people from Imperator to these other projects. Right now, we're working on plans to regrow the team for Imperator and continue development, but for the short term, we needed to focus our efforts on these other projects." End quote. Reaction from fans of the game was understandably surprise and disappointment. Many immediately speculated that there would never be new content for Imperator again. Others pointed to the poor launch of the game as its mortal wound. Commentators were chagrined that finally the game had reached its zenith with most of its original problems fixed, only for it to be discontinued. Ironically, some even speculated that developers needed to be pulled off of Imperator in order to work on Victoria 3. A fair amount of people also commiserated that at least mods from talented people in the community would continue. The following month, the game was review bombed, receiving 50% negative reviews in May of 2021. The end of Imperator was nigh. A funny thing happened on the way to the mausoleum of Imperator, however. People kept playing it. Not in the numbers who played Hearts of Iron or Crusader Kings, but a devoted collection of thousands of players, including myself. Yes, the game was officially not being worked on, but that didn't mean there was no game. With 2.0, along with the more incremental improvements of the patches before it, Imperator had become a rich, detailed, and addicting game. Each playthrough was different, even for the same country, depending on which missions you took or what goals you created for yourself. Debating which buildings to construct, which governors to place in which provinces, which omens to call upon, and which cultures to integrate left fans playing for hours on end. Surprise events and unexpected rivals kept engagement high. And away from the controversies, the monthly reviews of the game started to markedly improve. 76% positive in October 2021. 77% in June 2022, 87% in May 2023, and with a campaign championed on both Reddit and Paradox Forum, 98% positive in March 2024. Mods also gave the game increased longevity. The most beloved is Imperator Invictus. Any thread about which mods to download for the game is sure to have this front and center. It even has a trailer on YouTube that has an eye-popping 400-to-1 like to dislike ratio. Other mods extend the length of time you can play Imperator, such as Timeline Extender. Some work on the user interface, like 2.0 Better UI, with others adding more historical flavor, such as Crisis of the 3rd Century. Today, on Steam, Imperator sits at a 64% positive review rating overall. While that is not where Paradox wanted to see their ancient progeny, the reviews are a vast improvement compared to where they were at launch. The game today is also a vast improvement to where it was at launch. It is easy to sink dozens, if not hundreds of hours into vanilla Imperator Rome, to speak nothing of its excellent mods. The game has plenty to do, fun to be had, wars to be waged, and triumphs to be held. It is a history game with a negative history. But it is exactly this that makes the game so underrated. In this way, it is comparable to No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk 2077, but with dramatically less fanfare. If you've never played it, but like grand strategy games, or strategy games in general, I recommend you give it a try. If you played near launch and put it down, it is a vastly different experience today. Paradox has stated that they will release no new content for Imperator unless player counts dramatically increase. As of today, that is yet to come to fruition. I hope you enjoyed this history of Imperator Rome. Let me know what you think of the game or this video in the comments. And most importantly, thank you very much for watching.